Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Devine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM, and Robin Collier for managing KCEI in Taos. Walter Parks, thank you for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. And if you would like to reach me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. Always glad to get your emails. We'll be happy to answer you back. Navé is spelled N-A-V-E. And I'd like to remind you we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you'd like to improve your writing chops, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to go. And I also offer a free writing workshop every Saturday and Thursday. So if you'd like to find out more about joining our writing community, imaginativestorm.com, you'll find all the information there. So sometimes when I interview people, I have people on I've known for a long time. Other times I interview folks and I've met them on some kind of digital event like a Zoom meeting or a workshop on Zoom. And now and then I bump into somebody in a coffee shop. So my guest today is Kara Kroger. And last week we were sitting at Odd's Café on Haywood Street in West Asheville, North Carolina. And she was sitting at one of the round tables with plugs behind her, plugged in doing her work. I was next to her doing exactly the same thing. And I overheard Kara say, "I do a podcast." And of course, that piqued my attention because I love people who love radio. And a podcast, if it's anything, it's radio. So I said, "Hey, tell me about your podcast." And she turned and smiled and said, "I have a podcast and I'll tell you all about it." So today, she's here with us. I invited her to come on to Twice 5 Miles Radio. Kara, welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio.
Thank you so much, James. I'm very glad to be here, and it was really fun meeting you and talking with you there at the coffee shop.
Yeah, I had a great time. So you're here. You have an opportunity to tell me more about what you're up to. So let's just start with what we both love, the microphone, radio, and you love things that you do. You do work in nutrition. You also do work in food. You're interested in the soil. You told me you came from Texas and you grew up on the farm. And you understand cows, and you understand soil, and you also understand how humans relate to soil. We do more than just walk on the earth. And I'd love for you to just take an open-ended opportunity here to tell us why you're so excited about the relationship between humanity, all of us, and how we exist on this planet.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So many things there to touch on. Well, I didn't actually grow up on a farm or a ranch. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And growing up in Texas, you are really surrounded by a lot of agriculture and a lot of ranching. And even if you yourself maybe do not have a ranch, you wind up on other people's ranches a lot. Later, after 20 years in nutrition, I began spending time at a friend's ranch in Uvalde, Texas. And basically, this woman was a huge influence in my life. Her name was Sky Louie, and she was doing a lot in her area on the Nueces River to rebuild the riparian area, which is the area along the riverbanks that protects rivers and helps keep them clean and also allows them to function optimally. She had been working very diligently to remove some invasive species there and to also promote that all along Texas rivers in a very big way. She did a lot of really great work. And so when I started spending time on her ranch and getting to know her family, I was just intrigued. And this is an old ranching family that has been living off the land. Pretty cool experience. And it really changed my life. So I've been practicing as a nutritionist for 15 years. And I was just always in love with understanding where food came from. Because as a nutritionist, you're thinking about all the different phytonutrients that are in these foods, and you're studying these plant chemicals that can have different effects in the body, and how they can basically help protect us, act as antioxidants from free radicals and ultimately protect our body. And what we don't think about is how land management can improve those phytonutrients in foods. And so as I began doing more with Sky in terms of helping her restore her pastures, because she was trying to increase forage production in her pastures, because the more forage you have, the more cattle that you can safely carry on your land with the amount of forage that you have, and keep them fed and keep your land healthy, called carrying capacity. And so she was trying to increase her carrying capacity, and she was trying a lot of methods that just aren't normally used. Things like increasing the soil microbiome. The microbes that live in the soil are things that we are working in tandem with as humans nonstop, right? In our own guts, but this is also happening in the soil. And so ultimately, we were doing some different things, spraying different inoculants on the soil, grazing the animals in different patterns, sometimes making them very intense so that their urine and dung would be more prolific in that little space that we were grazing them, so that it would activate the microbes and improve soil health in that arena, in those areas. So those are just a few of the things that we were trying, and it just kind of inspired me. And so I went back to school and I got my degree in agriculture. And so for the past 8 years, I've been working within the realm of agroecology, and that's looking at how agriculture affects the bigger ecological systems and how we interact with those systems and how they nourish us as well, from both a social, economic, and environmental perspective, and spiritual perspective. I really don't like to leave out the spiritual piece.
I'm curious about a degree in agriculture. I know what a degree in political science is because I have one in international relations. I suspect a degree in agriculture requires a fair amount of science, hard science, biology, that sort of thing. What does one look like? What do you study when you get a degree in agriculture?
Well, I did a general degree in agriculture, and I would say that the hardest science class that you take in an agricultural program is definitely soil science. There's a lot of chemistry involved in that particular class, a lot of different formulas that you have to learn when you're thinking about soil science. And so ultimately, that is a very intensive class. Now, unless you're going on to become a soil scientist, I wouldn't say that agriculture is a particularly tough subject to learn. And it kind of also depends on what type of agriculture you want to go into, right? So there's animal science agriculture, there's finance, there's agronomy, and various things like that. I was always more interested in livestock management. And so that's the direction that I went towards. Regenerative farming. Regenerative farming is trying to give more back to the land than what you're taking from it. The goal in mind of trying to allow the land to regenerate itself while you're still utilizing it. A step beyond sustainable, right? Which is just sustaining what you have and moving into regenerative, which is trying to give a little bit back. And while I think that regenerative agriculture is awesome, I do not think it's the solution to all of our ag problems. Very hard to scale up regenerative agriculture. And so while it can be done in many scenarios, and even broad scale agriculture can take some of these principles and begin applying them, it still is not the one-stop shop for improving all things agriculture, but it is moving the needle, and it's something that a lot of people are finding very interesting and fascinating. A lot of those are very different principles than what people have been learning in agriculture programs, say for the past 50 to 75 years, when agriculture moved from small sustenance farming into big ag, which was get big or get out. And ultimately, that changed things way more in the direction of understanding inputs and using equipment and that type of thing. And so with regenerative ag, it's not necessarily saying that you don't do those things, but it's how do you reduce them. And so it's a little bit of a learning curve. And I've always worked more in the niche of livestock producers who want to sell direct to consumers, who are not necessarily raising animals that are going to go into a confined animal feeding operation. They're literally taking their animals to a local processor and trying to get a little bit more money in their pocket by having a smaller herd and selling it for a greater price per pound by marketing it direct to their local community and consumers.
Well, I want to go back to the comment you made about riverbanks protect rivers.
Yeah.
I was driving across the Smoky Park Bridge yesterday, looked down on the French Broad River, which runs into Tennessee, and saw all the rafts floating down the river. So it's summertime, lots of rafts are on the river. When I grew up here, I remember the French Broad River was so polluted, you could see the islands of foam floating down the river from the DuPont plant up in Brevard, as they say. And I remember the banks being ugly, ugly, ugly brown for yards up the bank. Tributaries like Hominy Creek, which is here, brown all the way up. Horrible, horrible.
Right.
I would love for you to talk to us and tell us more about how the riverbanks protect the rivers. And you mentioned microbes in the soil, and how similar are those microbes to the us as we walk on the earth. Can you tie all of that together for us? Because it's really fascinating. I was walking along the river. Microbes in my gut were active. I was afraid of the riverbank when I was young because it was so ugly and polluted. I didn't want to touch it. Can you
Mm-hmm.
tie that together for us?
Well, let's just start first with the function of a riparian, right? When we have things like animals on the upper lands that sit above a river, right? And this can be wild animals or it can be domesticated animals, or we have a factory, a DuPont factory or whatever is up there, right? Everything goes into the rivers. That's how it's like the vascular system of the earth. And so as we have these things on land, upland, whatever happens is going to secrete into the rivers. Now, that's very basic knowledge. Everybody knows that. Ultimately, when you have a working riparian area, and what that means is trees that are lining the river and grasses that are lining the river, as well as animals like beavers and other things that are living along the river, they are creating habitats that are helping keep the river clean. So if we have grasses, especially perennial grasses, they generally tend to have very, very deep root systems, right? And so as those grasses are growing, those root systems are moving deep, deep, deep into the soil, sometimes 10 to 15 feet down into the soil. Those root systems are stabilizing the bank of a river, right? So when you see a lot of flora along the riverbank, you're really going to be imagining what's happening below ground and what those roots are doing. And, when a river bank erodes, you can see, the roots that are all sitting there. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens, but ultimately those roots, whether it's a tree root or a grass root, are there to stabilize a bank. What also happens is when trees fall into a river, they're going to start creating some natural dams and things like that are going to allow water to pool and water be strained and slow down the flow of water when we have really big storms come through. And so, for instance, when a big storm comes through, I mean, we've all seen it before, especially like on TV right now, when you see this flooding and you just see massive amounts of land falling off a bank, it's because that water is moving at a force that's just too great and there's no natural damming happening. A lot of times people will move fallen trees out of a river to keep it pretty or to keep recreational use on it, but they don't necessarily realize that that's what is creating a diffusion of energy as heavy water comes through. So ultimately, having those deep roots from perennial grasses and trees and allowing beavers to cut down the trees and allow dams to form and just the natural process of that happening is an important function for creating healthy riparians. And so ultimately, though, when we relate that to microbes, what's very interesting is microbes absolutely need water to function. They senesce and they go into dormancy when there isn't moisture because the majority of the microbes that we're talking about are bacteria. And bacteria are teeny, 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 tiny. And they really don't have a lot of capacity to move themselves unless there's moisture around. And then they have a greater capacity to move because they need fluidity, right, in order to move their body. And so when you have a riparian area, that's holding water in the soil higher and higher up as you go into those higher lands around the banks of the river. And so when you have healthy riparians, you can move good microbial activity up into the higher lands around it. And then when we have functioning microbes, what's happening, they are taking the nutrients that are in the soil, they are mineralizing it with the enzymes that they produce, and they're making those nutrients bioavailable to the plant. The plant then takes up those nutrients, and then in return, it creates something called basically sugar. It's a sugar that is released out of the roots back into the soil that feeds the microbes. And that's how the microbes survive, is by drinking the sugar exudates that come out of the plant roots. And so the way that this is mimicked in the body, because as above, so below in every scenario of the universe, and maybe beyond, who knows, we have microbes in our own body, and microbes in our gut are doing the same exact thing, right? So for one, the microbes in our gut really, really need moisture in order to work well. They are going to need the sugars from us in order to be fed as well. So when we eat the fibrous vegetables, we are giving them both water and sugar. The water is helping create a strong environment for them to do their work inside of our gut, which is to mineralize the nutrients that we're eating from the foods that we're eating to make them bioavailable to our GI tract so that we can absorb them and nourish our body. But then also those fibers that we're consuming, they take those fibers in our colon and turn them into short chain fatty acids, which are also the fuel source for them to live long and prosper and to increase their numbers as well. And those short chain fatty acids have a lot of protective mechanisms. By way of them producing those short chain fatty acids, we have the capacity to improve our gut function. That's why eating a lot of different fibrous, rich foods is very helpful. We have parallel digestive systems, whether it's the soil acting as a digestive system that mineralizes nutrients for plant roots to uptake, or whether it's our GI tract, which has these microbes that are mineralizing nutrients for us to uptake and nourish our bodies. Those are very parallel. And so one of the things that we've seen is that as we've moved into this get big or go home conventional agriculture practices, a lot of those practices have been all about using inputs like herbicides, insecticides, and pesticides, as well as fertilizers that actually kill the soil microbes. And as we have killed off the soil microbiome, the microbiomes of our guts have also greatly decreased in the different diversity of the different microbes that are living in our GI tract. And so it's really a very intriguing thing to study this. We've barely scratched the surface of understanding the gut microbiome. Really only started studying it about 25 years ago. From a scientific perspective, soil was considered inert 25 years ago. There was no talk of microbiology in soil science work. And then when we started studying the human genome is when we began studying the human microbiome as well. And so while indigenous people have had this knowledge, completely understood it in many capacities, whether it was just intuitively using fermented foods or doing different practices such as putting fish emulsion into the crops. The fatty acids in fish emulsion do great work at feeding the microbiome of the soil. All along, these practices that indigenous people have used has been very much a deep, deep understanding, deeper than what we know now in some ways, but on a different level, on more of almost like a spiritual level, when we are super connected to nature and to the land in a more deep way where we're living so close to it. We get downloads from different mechanisms, whether it's plants talking to us and actually giving us that information in some way, whether it's through a message that comes to us in our dreams or potentially even just kind of like a revelationary idea. I do think that plants are sharing their intelligence with us in some levels that are known and unknown by science. So we have been given this information and we've learned from nature by just being close to it. And now we're so separate from it. We think we're learning all these amazing things through science, which is great. But I don't think that these are things that have not been understood at some capacity for thousands of years.
Gravity guarantees that we will always be close to the earth, whether we like it or not. Where else are we
Yes.
going to go? I'm not going to fly off into the sky. I'm curious about microbes. Birds. How many species of birds do we have on the planet? Thousands. Microbes. Do you have many different species of microbes, or is one microbe the same as another? And the microbes in my gut, would they be just as happy in the ground as they are in my gut? Or is it two different kinds of microbes?
That's a good question. So there are billions of different microbes, and we have barely scratched the surface of understanding that many of them. Just to put it in perspective, there's more microbes in our gut than there are stars in the universe. It's just insane. There's just massive amounts of microbes living within us and on us. If we were to take the DNA of microbes and compare it to the DNA in the human body, the human DNA would be equivalent to our big toe, and the rest of our body would be microbial DNA, like if you were to put that into a perspective ratio. So there is just massive, massive, massive amounts of microbial activity happening. We're breathing it in, we definitely are inhaling microbes, and it has a lot to do with our lung function. We're eating them on everything that we eat. I mean, a lot of things are more sterilized now because of the way that growing practices are. But if we're going out into the wild and we're eating berries and we're harvesting wild game, we are getting so many different microbes that do interact and do change. Now, what they say is that the microbes that are in our gut do stay relatively the same unless we have major dietary changes, right? Now, if somebody was eating like a standard American diet of a lot of fast food, highly processed foods, their gut's going to be one way. But if they were to all of a sudden change for the long term to eating more fruits and vegetables, and it doesn't matter whether they're organic or not, if they just move into eating more vegetables and not eating highly processed foods, their gut will shift. And it can shift within a 6-month time period or so. A lot can change there. It usually is only going to happen when you have major long-term dietary shifts. We've had drastic shifts in microbial diversity. So the diversity of our gut has shifted to much lower numbers from what they can understand. This is still being researched. In general, they think we have less diversity in our GI tracts than we used to when they look at indigenous GI tracts. And there's a few societies in the world where they can study that, where there hasn't been interference. They see very different species in the guts of these populations than what we see in, more civilized populations. And a lot of times it's the less opportunistic species. So it's the species that generally tend to cause less issues in the GI tract. They have more stabilized bacteria that don't tend to be opportunistic bacteria in terms of stealing nutrients and things from us, right? There's bacteria that we synergize with, and then there's bacteria that when they get out of the right numbers, if their population gets out of whack, it can cause issues in the gut, like dysbiosis, which can lead to a lot of digestive issues and things of that sort. And so basically these shifts are occurring, and these are the kinds of things that we're studying. There's still just so much to be learned about it all. The species of birds, as you were mentioning earlier, we've had a drastic reduce in above ground species biodiversity. In plants and insects, we've had a 30% reduction. in this fauna species living above ground, which is massive, right? That's like a huge, huge piece when you're thinking about what each of those species was doing in the ecosystem. Everything has a role. One of my mentors, Betsy Ross, a ranching woman that I worked with on her farm, raising grass-fed beef, she would always say, everything has a place with Mama Nature, even the fire ants and all the things that as a rancher can frustrate you to no end when you're trying to understand how to make a place for them and also take care of your bottom line in your business. But it's true, like everything has a place. Everything was here to do a job. There was a study that was done a while back, and it studied some tide pools. And it looked at the species that were in this tide pool, and there was something like 20 or 30 species in the tide pool. And they decided to remove one species, which was a starfish. It was a predatory starfish. And they removed that species from this little area of the tide pools. And when they removed that one species, it decreased all the other species in that tide pool. It decreased the species numbers by half. And so that one starfish was providing something that brought all those other species to that place to work in synergy with one another. We often don't realize what happens if we remove one species that's making the ecosystem work in some way and the huge effects that that can have. And so ultimately, one of the things that I study is called holistic management. And in holistic management, it's a way of looking at your business where you make goals and decisions based on a very important overarching goal that you create that is value based, right? So what's the biggest values that your family and your business partners have? And how do you make every decision in your business based on that one value? So a lot of people who are using holistic management as a way to plan their land management and their businesses, those values are to, create a space that allows nature to be itself, right? While also having a business on it. And then when you make a decision whether you're going to buy new equipment for your ag operation, you go through this big decision-making process about whether buying that piece of equipment is going to fit the goal of creating the space for nature to flourish and for your family to flourish. And so that's going to look at social, environmental, and economic components as well, and kind of break that decision down. And then you decide, okay, do I want to buy the tractor, or am I going to choose to do this in a different way, or maybe choose a different enterprise, find another resource on this piece of land that will allow me to fulfill that greatest value of keeping nature intact. Could be beekeeping instead.
You have just given us a great overview of how to exist on the land in harmony, holistic. I'd like for you to just take a moment and define holistic for us. I think I know what it means. I would like to hear your version of what holistic means, and then carry from that into how you help individuals, because I know you have a consulting business. People come to you, you coach them in their relationship with their food. And I'm particularly interested in organic versus not organic. You said organic is fine, but if you don't have organic, still eat blueberries.
So, holistic, in my opinion, is really looking at the big picture and moving from thinking in parts to thinking in whole systems. We are more than the sum of our parts. It's thinking about each individual part while also looking at the bigger picture as well. My work is really to help people move from thinking in parts to thinking in whole systems. In our body, we often are concerned with one particular thing, right? We might have one ailment that is an issue, and we go to an allopathic doctor and they give us a drug that is going to help with that one particular thing, right? So in general, that's not a very holistic way of looking at what you're dealing with. We're not thinking about how our ailment might be increased or, perpetuated by an emotional issue. But many people have had some kind of health ailment and they are in a relationship that's not really working for them, or they're working at a job that is very unhealthy and they're unhappy in that job. And so ultimately, it's taking its toll on their health. And then when they are able to remedy some aspects of their relationship or maybe find a different line of work, they're able to improve their health, right? And so if we just go and take one drug that works on one piece of the body, that is not allowing us to really look at the bigger picture. A lot of times we use medication, and I'm not knocking medication. I mean, I think that everybody gets to choose for themselves what they think is the best for their body, and medication may be the way to go about that. So I'm not trying to knock that. But a lot of times what happens is when we take a medication, we often get a lot of other symptoms that cause other issues in our body, instead of looking at the deeper picture and taking the time to start sorting out some of the emotional things that could be contributing to the ailment, as well as looking at the nutritional deficiencies that could be blocking that particular organ. Like, say, for instance, the thyroid has gone hypothyroid, where it's slowing down your metabolism. In some cases, there's different foods that can be blocking your body from taking up the nutrients that it needs in order to allow that thyroid to work well. And so how can we maybe remove some of those foods that can decrease that? The thyroid sits on top of the throat chakra, and the throat chakra is where we express ourselves. It's the chakra of allowing self-expression. And so maybe there's been some scenarios where you haven't been able to express yourself, and learning a little bit more about self-expression might be able to improve that thyroid issue as well. So these are the ways that you might look at something from a more holistic perspective. Having a practitioner that can guide you through a lot of different aspects of that can be really helpful, because it's very hard for us to see sometimes our own things. We all have blinders on. That's why being in community and relationship is so healing and helpful to us, so we can have that reflected by others as well. And then to speak to organic versus non-organic and that type of thing, I do choose to buy organic whenever possible. I do that for a few different reasons. One, because I have the capacity, and I know that not everybody has the capacity. And I think that that is okay, because there's still very many healthy foods out there. One of the main reasons why I try to buy organic is because I just really want to support less chemicals going on to the earth, and less chemicals going into our water, and less chemicals coming into my body. There is some very interesting research about how glyphosate, which is the herbicide that is used in most farming, especially in high doses and in genetically engineered crops, glyphosate was created to be an antimicrobial. And so ultimately it goes in and acts as an antimicrobial in our body as well as in the soil. And so it kills off the microbiome in our GI tract. There's a really good book about this. It's called Toxic Legacy. And I highly recommend that book if you want to learn more about glyphosate and all the different ways it works in the body. The main way that it works in a plant is plants have something called a shikimate pathway. And so it shuts down the shikimate pathway in a plant. And so they often say, oh, well, it's healthy for humans because humans don't have a shikimate pathway. But all of the microbes in our gut that we are working synergistically with, that literally we are more microbes than we are human, they have a shikimate pathway, and it does kill them. So that's one of the reasons why I try to buy organic. But that being said, vegetables are still very, very, very good for you, even if they're not organic. You know, the fibers that are in those foods, the different nutrients that are coming from those foods are leaps and bounds greater than any ultra processed food that you're going to eat. So just eat vegetables, just eat whole foods, and you're going to be in better shape than not, whether it's organic or not. And just drinking water. Yes. Is it good to drink purified water and try to get some of the different things out of the water that are in them? Yes, I do believe that that can be helpful. But I'd rather drink tap water than no water at all, right? And so drink the water, drink lots of water, eat lots of vegetables, Oftentimes we make things very complicated and we can get very nuanced, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's fine. It's fun to play with our chemistry and play with different foods in the body and see how they work, and especially with our personalities and our lifestyle types, that can be very interesting. But you don't have to get very complicated. You can start very, very small. Ideally, we should be eating 5 to 9 servings of vegetables per day. So what's a serving? A serving is 1 cup of any leafy green vegetable or a half a cup of any, chopped vegetable. I like to do about half raw and half cooked because you get different nutrients from cooked foods than raw foods. And ultimately, 5 to 9 servings. I mean, most people are getting 3 at the most. People who are doing better might be getting 5, but reaching that 9 is a lot harder for folks. So just start by trying to get a minimum of 3 if you do none, and then move up to 5 if you do 3. Little small things like that can be very helpful. I think that also just diversity in foods, eating about 30 different types of plant-based foods in a week gives you a nice array of phytonutrients as well as regular nutrients and a good amount of fiber. And those are all the things we need, right? We need the macronutrients like proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. We need the micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. Phytonutrients are, we've only documented a very, very small quantity of phytonutrients, which are things like anthocyanin and lycopene and beta carotene, and these things that are in foods. And plants basically produce phytonutrients to protect themselves. So plant is going to secrete a certain thing when it gets chomped on by a bug, right? And that phytonutrient and its secretion of aromas that are part of that phytonutrient, they work to either deter the plant or to signal other plants in the community that they are under attack and to protect themselves. So these things are working on many levels. And so when we eat the 30 different foods, we're going to have a lot of those phytonutrients as well as fiber and micronutrients. So just trying to eat a lot of different things. We get in habits of eating the same things over and over. Try to go to the farmer's market and look at what's in season at that time and move with the seasons so that you can change up the different nutrients you're getting. A lot of the foods that are growing in a particular season have a lot of the things that we need for that season. Winter, we're eating a lot of cruciferous vegetables, which are really high in vitamin A. They increase our immunity. And then in the summer, a lot of the foods that we eat, like squash and cucumbers and watermelon, they're very cooling foods, or they have a lot of beta carotene or, different things that can protect us from the sun. They're cooling and high in water, which we need more hydration in the summer. So those are just some things to consider.
So it strikes me as you were talking holistic. Often when you hear that word, you think, oh, holistic, organic, holistic, health food store, holistic, natural.
Mm-hmm.
The way I'm understanding holistic, after you talked about it a bit, whole system understanding. So you understand a whole system. So one could be holistic about having your car, because if you change the oil regularly and you maintain the car, it lasts longer. You can be holistic about your house, maintaining your house. Holistic, obviously, about your health. You could have a whole system understanding about accounting, even holistic about your education. Is my education a whole system education, or is it a narrow focused education that doesn't allow for expansion? So I appreciate that insight. As I was sitting here, I was thinking, what are all these little things that I have to deal with to keep my life up? It's not just what's on my plate. It's the entire environment. And then, of course, if you expand out to the world, understanding the whole system of the planet, which also includes all of the systems of the planet, working so they will benefit the longevity of the object, like the car or the house or the planet or the gut.
Yeah, it just comes back to the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that when we can try to think about that in our greatest capacity, I mean, the reality is that can be very, very challenging to do. But the more that we can kind of keep that as a theme in our existence and try to move in this world with that as a goal, we're a little bit ahead of the game. And I think that because we're so removed right now from natural rhythms, because we are, living very separated, we're not getting reminded of that as much. I've worked with a lot of families in their nutrition. For 5 years, I worked as a nutritionist for families who were working to improve autism spectrum disorders with nutrition and different brain balancing effects, doing different exercises that balance the right and left brain. When you are in a place where you are so overcome by the intensity of a situation, expanding out and looking at the whole picture can be so challenging because you're in such a mode of just trying to deal with what is happening right in front of you, right? Believe me, I understand how that can be. And it takes a while to learn these things, and it takes a while to integrate them, right? You learn them, but it may take years for you to integrate some of them to the level in which they're really making big, big change in your life, right? You can see some small changes. When I first started eating brown rice versus white rice, I didn't want to do it all the time, but I slowly did it. And then eventually my palate changed. And then eventually I wanted the brown rice more than I wanted the white rice. But it took time. It took integrating in my mindset of a particular age and a particular time in my life, and how much you're moving and shaking and how much you're staying at home. There's all these pieces. It's important to really think about where you are and how you integrate things. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What can I do here that benefits the whole?
As we move to the close of our time together, would you reflect and sum up with some thoughts on the spiritual view of things that you have regarding all of this work you do? And then tell us how we can get in touch with you so people can reach out and find out more about you.
Yes, absolutely. The spiritual side, it's beyond words in a lot of ways. It's in my body, ancestral, as well as energetic frequencies in this atmosphere and beyond where we are living. I was lucky at a very young age to be turned on to learning about energetic frequencies. I had some learning disabilities growing up called dysgraphia. And so I was always just a little bit more sensitive than some others. And luckily, I had a mom and an aunt and a grandma who were all studying a lot of different spiritual philosophies. So anything from Christianity to Buddhism to Hinduism, these were things that we discussed. There was just so many different influences. I read about different things, but really, I just always had a feeling, right, of connectedness to nature from a very young age. I mean, I'm a trained herbalist, but when I was 5 years old, I'd go out into the yard, as many 5-year-olds do, and I would just pick plants, and then I'd come inside and I'd mix it with some baking soda and some water, and then I'd go outside and I'd put it on the branch of the tree that had just been cut. Why did I do that? How did I even know to do that? But I was doing it, and I just think it's so interesting, right? So, I think that there's just a lot of unspoken spiritual energies around us that are bringing awareness. Ultimately, I just really think that everything is so, so very, very connected. And as I've gone deeper and deeper into understanding the body's health and living on ranches and living in forests, when you live in a natural place that's less influenced by civilization and you live there for a number of years, you get to see these rhythms and you really get to learn a lot from nature. It's talking to you, it's showing you a lot of different things. So that in and of itself has also really increased my capacity for understanding the connectedness of things. And from a spiritual perspective, I would say also that doing some ceremonial work with different shamans in Mexico, some that were just non-psychotropic plant-based and some that were psychotropic plant-based, both, working with shamans and kind of moving into different realms with people that can access different information. There's people on this planet who can access different information than other people being trained in shamanism. And so that is something that I started doing. I started traveling to Mexico when I was about 18 years old on my own and studying with different plant healers in Mexico, mostly non-psychotropic. You do not have to access psychotropic plants to move into some really, really different spaces. Being still is important for learning how to think about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Get still, stop doing, just be an observer. Observing is everything. Sometimes observing rather than doing will teach you a lot. So I'd say that's the one way in, is to learn how to be still.
And before we say goodbye, please tell everybody how to connect with you.
Fabulous. So my podcast is called the Land Food Life Podcast, and that can be found on Apple, Spotify, Google. It can also be found on my website, which is landfoodlife.com. I have a nutrition program that is also called Balance Your Gut, and that program can be found at balanceyourgut.com. It can also be found on Land Food Life as well. Please have a look at all of those things, and you can email me via my website at landfoodlife.com or balanceyourgut.com. And I would be glad to answer any questions or have a chat with any of the listeners out there. And James, I really appreciate you giving me the floor here and taking the time to interview me. And I'm glad that we got to connect, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it too. And thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I really, really am glad.
Excellent. Thank you.
So there you go, my friends. Thus concludes my conversation with Kara Kroger. Coffee shops. I've met lots of people in coffee shops, many of whom I've continued on with a friendship over the years. So Kara and I, as I said earlier in the show, met at Odd's Café. I was at one of the round tables along the wall, and so was she. And from there, we now know about microbes. We now know about the microbes. And because of that meeting, Kara and I just had a great conversation. And I hope you learned as much about microbes as I did. And I hope you have a better sense of why when a tree falls in the river, leave it there. Let it do what it needs to do. When Kara started talking about rivers and tributaries, I immediately flashed on the French Broad River when I was growing up. As I said in the interview, I remember standing on the banks of the French Broad River with my grandfather. We called him Pappy. I don't know why we were there. He smoked a Tampa cigar, and he and I were standing at the river, and he was talking about the industry upstream. As I said in the interview, the DuPont plant was upstream near Brevard and other plants as well. So Pappy was very proud of the industry. And I don't know, I don't really remember if this is true or not, but somehow I vaguely remember him looking out at the dirty river saying this was just what has to happen in order to have all this play out. So to this day, I still think about that. And I remember playing around Hominy Creek and French Broad River when I was a boy and how filthy it was. It was just absolutely awful. And later I wrote a little poem about it. It's titled The French Broad River, and I'd like to read it for you now. In 1963, white foaming cyanide, zinc, lead, copper, and mercury floated downstream on brown scum, and even poison ivy died within 20 feet of the river. Progress, my grandfather would say, smoking his Tampa cigar. He was a smart man who never washed his car. He sold farm tractors at the co-op to earn his living. He voted straight Republican until the day he died in Florida, trying to avoid the Carolina cold that settles on the fields in January. And that little poem was titled The French Broad River. A side note, the French Broad River is called the French Broad River because back in the 17 and 1800s, broad was the name for river. And French Broad meant that's the territory demarcation between the English and the French. The French Broad River, it's been there a long time. The French Broad River's been there a long time, and I'm sure I wasn't the only child standing beside a grandfather, watching the river flow to Tennessee and talking about life. My grandfather died in 1972. I have a vague memory of talking to him on the phone one last time about 6 months before he died. He had moved to Florida, left North Carolina behind, like so many people did back then, and so many people are doing to this day. My grandfather was a resourceful man. He was an inventor. He made things. He even built the steeple that now still sits on Sardis Church. I've mentioned that a few times in this podcast. When I'm in Asheville, I often drive down Brevard Road just to look at the church and remember my grandfather building the steeple in the backyard and hauling it up there and somehow getting it on top of the church, fastening it down. So he was a resourceful man. He was quite a character. He was very opinionated. And I really looked up to him. Although now that I think about it, I really didn't know him at all. So when Kara was talking about the French Broad River, the rivers running through things, not only did she bring up memories of the river and how polluted it was, she also brought up memories of my grandfather. And now, if you go to the French Broad River or to Hominy Creek, it's much cleaner. Still not fully clean, not pristine. Even so, people are still able to float down it. I don't know if people fish in the French Broad River, but I imagine they do. I don't know for sure if people fish in the French Broad River, but I imagine they do. Probably fish have returned to the river. Certainly the microbes live in the French Broad River. And on that note, I'd like to offer you a poem I wrote about a bug. I know a bug is not a microbe, and yet a bug is small, and you can have a relationship with a bug. So this is a little children's poem that has a lot of adult suggestions in it, titled The Bug. Here you go. If you see a bug and a bug sees you, tell me then, what will you do? Will you dance and sing and run and play and say to the bug, well, it's okay that the world is wet and green and lean, and you are the finest bug I've ever seen? I'll tell you the truth because I know that in this world, wherever you go, you'll find a bug that will be your friend, one that will tell you exactly when it's time to get up and time to come in. So if you find that bug, keep your feet on the floor. Don't mash it in the head or kick it out the door. It'll be your buddy. It'll be your friend. It'll carry your flag around the bend. Put it on a plant, set it in the sun, watch it grin and jump and run from leaf to leaf and stem to stem. So just remember, it's up to you. Don't kick those bugs, whatever you do. And tomorrow when one comes dancing along, beat on a milk jug and sing your song. Then you'll know the world is fine, 'cause you and the bugs will all be trying to get along and have some fun dancing on the grass till the day is done. So I'll ask you once more and answer me true. If you see a bug and a bug sees you, tell me then, what will you do? And that was The Bug. And I loved writing that poem years ago. And I refer to it often. It's a very rhymey poem. Even so, it does sum things up. And it sums them up in a really beautiful way. So as Kara was talking about all the environmental things, including us, you, me, everything that's inside of us, I kept thinking about the poem, The Bug, and the one about my grandfather and how I lived in North Carolina and loved to run around in the woods and watch all the bugs, catch the lizards, see the birds, which reminds me of Dylan Thomas's poem, Fern Hill. So I'd like to close with a few lines that open up, which always remind me of when I was growing up in Western North Carolina. So here you go. As I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes, and honored among wagons I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his meads. I hope all of you have some kind of childhood memory that glows a bit like Fern Hill. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org. The voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Davine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM-FM in Asheville. Robin Collier for managing KCEI FM Cultural Energy Radio in Taos. You can always reach me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled N-A-V-E. Would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out if you are so moved. I'd like to remind you we are sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you would like to improve your writing chops, you can always start at imaginativestorm.com, and my creative collaborator, Allegra Houston, and I offer a weekly free workshop on Zoom, Saturdays and Thursdays. So if that's something that strikes your fancy, imaginativestorm.com, and you can always join us if you like. So once again, thanks ever so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And before we meet again, perhaps I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.